Hello, my name is Ghani. I am a trainee educational psychologist at UCL Institute of Education and Lambeth Educational Psychology Service. Today I'm going to be talking to you about managing back to school anxiety using simple cognitive behavioral strategies. As a global society, we're facing an unprecedented time of change and uncertainty as social distancing measures are relaxed and schools reopen post the COVID-19 lockdown. Undeniably, this period has affected everyone. For some, this has been a mostly safe and enjoyable time, whereas for others, it has been challenging or traumatic. Regardless, though, of the varied experiences, adjusting to the world in the midst of a global pandemic has involved learning to tolerate uncertainty, which can be anxiety provoking. Now, although we have limited experience in responding to a situation of this magnitude, there are evidence based strategies for anxiety that can be adapted to respond to the needs of the current situation. So, by understanding anxiety and how it works, there are many things that we can do to support ourselves and our children. This short webinar is for parents and it explains how we can use simple cognitive behavioral tools to manage anxiety as we support pupils to return to school post the COVID-19 lockdown. So, the first step to dealing with anxiety is understanding what anxiety is. Anxiety is our body's natural response to danger. If our brain senses we are in danger, the part in our brain involved in processing emotions, called the amygdala, kicks into action and gets our body ready to either fight the threat, run away from the threat, or freeze with fear. So, in moderation, anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing. Let's now think back to primitive times, cavemen in the primitive times. Back then, we would experience a fight, flight, or freeze reaction because dangers were a real and genuine threat, such as being confronted by a saber-toothed tiger. But now in modern life, we are less able to differentiate between an actual real threat of a tiger or that of a perceived threat, such as that of perhaps going back to school. And therefore, we still experience anxiety even though it may not be adaptive. This is to do with the fact that our worlds and our brains have become more complicated. Life isn't as simple anymore as in the animal kingdom. In the current context, where everyday interactions of being in close proximity to others have become indicators of threat, to an extent it is normal to respond with fear, worry, and hypervigilance so we can be sensitive to these threats, avoid them, and preserve our safety. So, how does knowing all this help? Understanding why we feel anxiety is the first step in learning how to manage it. Dr. Daniel Siegel, an expert on emotional intelligence, coined the term "name it to tame it," suggesting that by naming our emotions, we help to re-engage the thinking part of our brain. So, as a psychologist, we use lots of different theories to help us understand difficult feelings. And the cognitive behavioral model is a very useful one for overcoming anxiety. It explores the links between our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and our physiological responses. This can help us identify unhelpful ways of thinking, to test the evidence for these thoughts, and in turn discover and replace these thoughts with more helpful and more balanced thoughts. It is based on the idea that how we feel is affected by the way we think. So this may all seem abstract. So let's have a look at two examples now. This is anxious Andy and the negative trap. So for the sake of this example, we are calling him anxious Andy as he is terribly worried about everything to do with going back to school, and he has lots of fears about the virus. So when he thinks about school, he's constantly thinking, what if I contract the virus? Will people make fun of me wearing a mask? This makes him feel anxious, overwhelmed, irritable, and nervous. These feelings impact him physiologically as he complains of fatigue and butterflies in his tummy. His behavior reflects his thoughts, feelings, and physical state as he mainly just wants to avoid school, is withdrawn and quiet. So we can say then that anxious Andy is stuck in a negative trap, which is a cycle of negative thoughts and stress responses in his body that impact his behavior of avoiding school. Now let's see if what would happen if the child had different thoughts about going back to school. Now let's compare anxious Andy and the negative trap to excited Ed and the magic circle. Now, Ed is thinking, if I practice safety precautions that I have been taught, I can be reasonably sure that everything will be okay. My teachers or parents cannot completely eliminate risk regardless of COVID-19. These thoughts make him feel calm, prepared, and even excited to return to school. His muscles are relaxed, and you see him preparing his school bag, checking his school uniform, and getting into his school routine. So, who or what made Andy anxious? When we feel anxious, it is often in response to something that we call a trigger. Anxiety triggers can be people, places, situations, someone's actions, and so on. People often think that anxiety triggers make us anxious. But if it was the people, places, situations, or someone's actions that made us anxious, then all of us would feel the same way in the same situation. So the important message here is that we get anxious because of the way we think. Although each of the factors in the cognitive behavioral model all impact each other. So if your child is worried about going back to school, you can ask your child to write or draw the types of things they're anxious about. Understanding your anxiety triggers is an important step in addressing them. The trigger stage is also the point where we are most likely to be able to intervene successfully to diffuse situations before they escalate or have reached a crisis point. There is no point in trying to help a child develop skills when they're in a high state of stress. They need to be in a calm state and willing to work for learning and developing new skills. Now, there are a range of thinking errors that one can get caught in. For example, anxious Andy could be blowing things out of proportion or catastrophizing. He could be thinking, all of us will catch the virus when we get back to school. Anxious Andy could be looking for things that go wrong or aren't good enough. For example, he could be thinking, how come one teaching assistant wasn't wearing a face mask in school today? Anxious Andy could also be using his all or nothing or black and white thinking. For example, I am at risk if I go to school and I am only safe at home. For a further list of thinking errors, have a look at the link attached to this video. But in the meanwhile, for all of these thinking errors, what could anxious Andy be thinking instead? So, if he is catastrophizing, he could think, what if things aren't as bad as I make them out to be? If he is mentally filtering only negative information, he could be thinking, how do the positive outweigh the negatives in this situation? If he is engaging in black and white thinking, he could consider how many different ways could people interpret this. But an important reminder, now balanced thinking is not about rationalizing your thought. It is not about seeing everything positively. Balanced thinking is about looking for new information that you might have overlooked. Hence, our thoughts have to be realistic, otherwise we would be fooling ourselves into thinking that everything is problem-free, and that just isn't the case. So, if we find ourselves falling into these negative traps, we can choose to challenge our thoughts by being a thought detective. This means asking ourselves questions about the thought, such as, is this thought helpful or unhelpful? What evidence is there to support this thought? What evidence is there to question this thought? What would my best friend, teacher, parent say if they heard I was thinking that way? What would I say to my best friend if they had this thought? You will also find a link attached to this video about challenging thoughts that you may find useful. In addition to having thought detective conversations, we can also try behavioral experiments. For example, let's test the thought that everyone will laugh at me if I wear a face mask by going outside with the face mask and seeing what happens. A reminder, though, that taking small steps to face your fear increases your chances of success towards the desired outcome. For example, maybe start by wearing a mask for a few minutes in the home, then on the house doorstep, and gradually build the steps towards the target. So, what keeps our anxiety going? It is important to remember that the cognitive behavioral model does not operate in isolation. It interacts with others. Therefore, anxious adults can lead to anxious children. Think of how parents may instill fear in their children based on their own fears. Example, someone who was afraid of a bee would probably show a very intense fear reaction in front of their child. So if a bee was nearby, they would perhaps model the fear behavior and encourage the child to stay away from the bee, therefore perpetuating the belief that the bee is dangerous. So we need to be mindful of the things we may be doing that will encourage maintaining the cycle of anxiety for children. For example, we may be demonstrating anxious behaviors ourselves. We may be reacting to the child in an anxious way. We may be becoming overly involved and protective. We may be reassuring them too much. We may perhaps not be encouraging them to try new things. That brings us then to the end of this webinar. I really hope you have found some of the strategies we have spoken about to be helpful. But remember, the key is practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the easier it will become for you to manage your negative thoughts. So stick with the strategies that work for you. And also, while experiencing anxiety during these times is normal, when these thoughts and feelings are taking over your child's daily life, or even your own, it may be time to look for assistance. You can talk to your GP or ask for advice from the SENCO at school. If they think you need further support, they can signpost or refer you to another service if needed. Thank you.